Hold on to your Joy-Con drift, everybody. Nintendo caught too many people having fun again. Breaking news, officially today, Nintendo has reached a settlement with the creators of popular Switch emulator Yuzu, in which Yuzu agrees to pay Nintendo $2.4 million, and they agree to shut down and discontinue support for both Yuzu and Citra. Now, in case you don't know, you aren't caught up on what's going on, this all started a few days ago on February 27th. Nintendo issued a lawsuit against the creators of Yuzu, saying that their technology illegally circumvented Nintendo's software encryption and facilitates piracy. They were seeking damages for alleged violations and a shutdown of the emulator as a whole. Now, before we go any further, in case you don't know what Yuzu and Citra are, let me explain it really quick. Yuzu is a popular Nintendo Switch emulator where if you have a ROM of a Switch game, you buy a Switch game, you can transfer it to your PC, you can then play that, you can use Yuzu to play your Switch game on the PC and just move it over there. Citra does the same thing respectively, but for Nintendo 3DS games. Nintendo noted in the lawsuit that over 1 million copies of Tears of the Kingdom were illegally downloaded prior to the game's release, and they said Yuzu's Patreon support doubled during that time. They were basically arguing that this is proof that Yuzu's business model helps piracy flourish. I get this from Twitter user Steven Totilo. Totilo. That's my fault. I'm bad at reading names. They also cited a few other instances, including that Tears of the Kingdom spoilers were out and around before the game's official release, and that was somehow negative news against Yuzu. So, what specifically was Yuzu being sued for by Nintendo? I made a meme tweet about this whole situation earlier. Not that this is necessarily a laughing matter, but I made a meme tweet about this whole situation earlier, and a lot of people replying to me seemed to misunderstand what the lawsuit was about exactly. So, let's go over really quick what is and isn't legal, as far as I'm aware, in terms of game piracy, emulation, ROMs, downloads, all that stuff. Now, before we get into this, I am not a lawyer under any circumstances, but I have been around the gaming block a time or two, the online scene. You tend to see, like over the years that I've done this, you see what companies take games down for and what they don't take it down for, and I've done a little bit of reading here and there. Again, I'm not an expert. I might get one or two minor things wrong, but for the most part, I think my general understanding is relatively on point. So, Yuzu, and what Yuzu also supports, Citra, the 3DS emulator, are emulators. They are just that. Emulation itself, to my understanding, is 100% and perfectly legal to do online. If you can create an emulator yourself that is capable of running a Nintendo Switch game or a PlayStation game or an Xbox game or whatever, you have the rights to do that. This goes all the way back to like Game Boy Advance games. A lot of people nowadays tend to enjoy playing their Generation 1, 2, 3, 4 Pokemon games on emulators on their PCs because it's convenient. But if it is perfectly legal to create and distribute an emulator, then why is Yuzu being sued? Well, a lot of people in my Twitter replies that I was mentioning, that tweet I made earlier, seem to have a misconception that it was specifically because Yuzu was charging for certain early access builds of the Yuzu emulator. So like before Tears of the Kingdom came out, I think even when the Switch, like when they were new on making the Switch emulator itself, they actually had a Patreon up because to my understanding, it takes a full team of developers. You got a lot of people working on this to make it happen and a lot of people who have to work to keep the emulator updated because anytime a new game comes out or anytime the Switch drops a new update, they have to update the emulator as well. It takes a team of people to get working on this. And a lot of people seem to have the idea that because they decided to charge for an emulator, that's the part that was illegal, and I don't believe that's true. Because it's like I said earlier, emulation and creating an emulator and using that emulator yourself, those things are not illegal. Whether they're making a profit off of making the emulator or not, that's not necessarily illegal to my knowledge. The part that Nintendo is specifically suing about is the circumvention of their software encryption. So this is where it gets a little fishy. So if you go back to the Game Boy Advance, right? For example, or a Game Boy Color game, you can emulate those games no problem. You load up your emulator, you plug the ROM that you have in, that you put in, and the game starts up. Because if you go back to the Game Boy Advance itself, there's no software encryption, there's no homepage, there's no anything like that. You turn the game on and it just works. More modern games, I don't know if it started with the PlayStation 2, but this is the emulator that I know kind of runs into issues like this. More modern systems have an encryption key in a BIOS to their system, right? It's their own lines of code and it's their own encryptions that they've made to avoid people making emulators on their stuff. And something with the specifics of how the Yuzu team had gone about bypassing those encryption services is what Nintendo was suing about. So Nintendo, they own the Switch, right? If you can find a different way to create an emulator to create your own system on your PC that runs Switch games that you may have bought, that isn't illegal. But they have their own specific software encryption and code lines and stuff inside of that. And if you distribute that, then that is illegal. That's almost like distributing a game, and that's not legal, right? Again, to my understanding, not a lawyer, this is my loose knowledge of it, but I'm trying to get everybody the rough idea in layman's terms that I feel like everybody can understand. So if we go back and look, I believe that the misconception that Yuzu using a Patreon and making a profit off of their emulator is the reason that they're being sued. I think that that misconception stems from the fact that in Nintendo's lawsuit, they actually point to the fact that Yuzu's Patreon supporters went up. So while they can use it as a reference to note that, like, oh, well, they are making piracy because their Patreon went up when Tears of the Kingdom came out a little bit early, it's not because they had a Patreon. It's because they can correlate their Patreon with privacy as a whole, which, to me, looking back at it, again, not a lawyer, looks like really loose grounds to prove that a company is promoting piracy because they weren't. To go over it one more time, emulation isn't illegal. Distribution of ROMs, distribution of the games themselves, is illegal. So the idea is that if you're going to use an emulator of a game, old or new, but you can get an emulator, or a system old or new, but you can get an emulator of it on your PC, you should, in theory, already own that game yourself if you want to be within your legal bounds, and then you take your copy of the game and you find a way to get it on your computer system through some kind of file transfer or whatever, right? Technically speaking, if you are downloading a ROM from the internet anywhere, that is illegal, right? That's the part that's not legal. Unless you bought it straight from the Nintendo store and they beamed it straight to your Switch, it's not legal. That's the part that's going to get you in trouble. But Yuzu, again, technically, as far as the emulation part was concerned, wasn't really doing that. The part where it got fishy was with the Nintendo data encryption key and what they were trying to do to prevent that. All right, now that we've got all the more in-depth technical mumbo-jumbo out of the way, I'm going to talk for a little bit about why this sucks. First of all, Yuzu having emulation was a really nice gateway to circumvent how limited the Switch hardware is, okay? I had initially, I may or may not have initially done a playthrough of Breath of the Wild, which I had bought and owned, on another emulation service for the Wii U back in the day, and it was just a really great way to get a game that did not stutter, a game that did not lag, a game that had its graphics improved, a game that had a much more consistent and better looking frame rate. To me, it was the ultimate way to experience Breath of the Wild, and I was able to do it using an emulator, emulation, because the Wii U and even the Switch are not really up to the task. I also recently on my stream was able to do a pretty nice playthrough of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and it's not just the upscales and it's not just the games running smoother that makes them better. You can also modify them a little bit, which I don't know the legality on modifying, but I had a very fun time with it. But Nintendo going after things like this is a little bit scary because if they're able to get what they want out of this case, then it's a little bit concerning as to what they might continue to go after in the future. Because, I've said it too many times already, emulation isn't illegal. But if Nintendo thinks that they can go in and bully these companies into settling out of court like they did with Yuzu, then they're going to. They've proven time and time again they are not at all on the side of the people or the people playing their games or the people trying to improve their experience on their games. They are 100% on the side of themselves and on the side of what is going to make them the most money. They have been doing this for years and years and years. We have seen it basically since YouTube cropped up and we've been able to spread this information a little bit better. Nintendo is always going to pick Nintendo. So while this technically didn't go to court, they settled out of court, and that's kind of good for everybody except Yuzu. I'll get into that in a minute. It still is not a good sign for where Nintendo is trending, and unless they go to bully another one of these companies and then the other company actually stands up for themselves, it might get a lot worse before it gets any better. So I already mentioned the first reason on why Yuzu getting shut down sucks, because it was a good, and there are other emulators out there, but it was a good way to get, you know, higher quality, more consistent frame rate, all that stuff that I mentioned. But we haven't even really talked about Citra yet. Citra is a 3DS emulation service. Now, what made Citra so special is that the 3DS eShop, it either isn't up anymore at all, or the servers are getting shut down in April, something like that. I should have done more research on that, but I know the servers are either going away or they're already gone. Meaning, I can't go pay Nintendo to play any 3DS games anymore, even if I wanted to. There is no place that I can go to hand Nintendo my money or to send them money from my bank account and then download their 3DS game and play it the way that I want to. It doesn't exist anymore. So Nintendo, maybe by side effect, but by incidentally taking down Citra as well as Yuzu, they have removed any means to play their games at all. If you were alive and bought the 3DS when it was out and you bought all the 3DS games that you wanted when it was out, great. You are set until your 3DS breaks and you have to buy another one secondhand. That's fantastic. But if you weren't there for that, or if you lost your game copy, or it got scuffed or something, and you don't want to pay an exorbitant amount of money for another game copy because those prices have shot up since the server's gone down, you're just SOL. Nintendo not only doesn't want you to be able to afford to buy the old stuff again, because those prices have got up and they're not distributing them anymore, they don't want you to be able to find them online at all either, and that's a little bit fucked. I already know people are going to say this, so I'm going to beat them to it. Technically speaking, it is their property, and they can do whatever they want with it, but is that not just the most anti-consumer thing you've ever heard? I'm sure they plan on selling it back to you again later. That seems to be the trend lately. Let a game go out of style. In Nintendo's case, make sure people have no way to properly emulate that game, even though they still own it. The system might just be out of style at this point. But make sure people have no way to play or emulate that game and then resell it to you for a higher price a few years down the road. It's very anti-consumer, it's very anti-player. I'm not at all a fan of it, but let's keep moving forward. I wanted to talk briefly on why the lawsuit of Nintendo that Nintendo issued against the creators of Yuzu being settled outside of court. As it stands currently, just right now, it could get much worse in the future, but as it stands right now, that's kind of really good for everybody who isn't Yuzu. It sucks, like I said before, that Yuzu has to shut down. Thankfully, there are other emulators who maybe, I don't know what they did specifically to make Nintendo upset. Maybe they were a little bit lax on getting past Nintendo software encryption. Maybe they were a little bit heavy-handed on the, being able to correlate their Patreon numbers going up was enough for Nintendo to think, oh, they're making money, and even though that's legal, we should still go after them for this. I'm not sure what it was, but Yuzu specifically they went after. There are still other Switch emulators and things of the like out there for now. But the reason that this is okay, not great, for everybody except for Yuzu is that they settled out of court. Settling out of court to me means two things. Number one, other emulators are still allowed to exist. And number two, because this didn't go to court, this didn't have an opportunity to set a precedent on how emulation should be handled in the future. Now, there's a couple ways this could have gone down if it went to court. So, number one, let's just assume that Nintendo would have won the lawsuit. This thing goes all the way to court. Somehow the Yuzu creators actually have the money to fund it. I'm assuming part of the reason that Yuzu was okay with settling out of court is because, if you get in a legal battle with Nintendo, they will probably be in a legal battle with you forever. They will probably do the big corporation thing where they try and drain all of your funds, make sure you can't actually properly get to the end of the court case with actual lawyers and be able to afford the whole thing. And Nintendo ultimately might have been able to beat them down and win in the court case that way. And if Nintendo wins, let's just say hypothetically Nintendo not only wins, but they get everything that they want, the verdict would have came through, the ruling could have been something like, yeah, we agree this whole emulation and getting around the encryption key things is illegal, Yuzu owes you money and should shut everything down. But the important part being that they agree that an emulation aspect of it and getting around encryption and whatnot is illegal. That would be horrible because that would officially set a precedent for any emulator ever to be sued, to be turned off, to be shut down, right? It would essentially flip from making emulation legal as it currently is to making it illegal, and that's what the case went is the worst it could have possibly gone, but it's still an option. And, right away you would have your PS2 emulators gone, any Nintendo emulator gone, any emulator on your phone. If you have an Android and you can play Game Boy games or what have you, completely gone. I know a lot of people are using their Steam Decks for emulation, wouldn't be able to do that anymore. Like all of those, we would probably see mass lawsuits from a lot of gaming companies immediately take over the system and try to remove any emulator that ever existed, which would be horrible. Now, one of the reasons this might not have gotten pushed all the way through court is because Nintendo probably wasn't 100% confident they could win. By settling out of court, everybody wins, except for Yuzu, because Yuzu has to shut down their program. They have to stop their support of Yuzu and Citra. And like I said before, that sucks. But Nintendo wins because they get to do what they do best, which is where they get a legal team to bully smaller, creators who are making their product more usable, right? That is one of Nintendo's favorite pastimes, is being able to do that. And they get $2.4 million in damages. And then we also, in our own way, win. It sucks because we lose Yuzu, and it sucks because there is a looming threat of Nintendo continuing this trend. That is always there, and that is ass. But the way that we win is that the other emulators are still up, and the other emulators are still legal. You will probably see future emulation teams be a little bit more wary about using a Patreon, because like I said, the reason that Yuzu got sued was not because they were making money off of what they were doing, but Nintendo did try to use that to amplify their lawsuit, which was over the encryption keys and over them promoting piracy, which isn't necessarily the case. So you might see some creators step away from the emulation scene entirely, which is bad because if they can't make enough money off of it, they have to, keep at their day jobs, find income elsewhere. They just might not have the time for it. But there are still emulators out there, and emulation is still allowed to exist as it stands currently, unless Nintendo continues this tirade, which ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, for right now at least, is still okay for the users. Emulators can still exist we can still play on them for now. And I find a little bit of solace in the idea that Nintendo didn't want this thing to go all the way through, because they're not fully confident they could win a case like this if they were to push the full way, because if they do push this whole case to the very end and then they lose in the worst way they could lose, they shoot themselves in the foot. Creators would be allowed to be a little bit more free with their Patreons when they're helping create these emulators. People who create the emulators would be allowed to breathe a little bit more easy when it comes to lawsuits if there was a precedent set that says they are completely legal and within their rights to do what they're doing. Because some of the things that rubbed me the wrong way was, like, in Nintendo's lawsuit that they put out, one of the things that they were going after specifically, they cited that Tears of the Kingdom spoilers were out before the game's official release. That was part of their lawsuit, like, official beginning statement against Yuzu. That was part of what was being said when they were first suing Yuzu before they settled out of court. One of the reasons they were given that Yuzu promoted piracy was because Tears of the Kingdom spoilers were on Twitter. They were trying to correlate that with Yuzu and emulation somehow, but, like, Yuzu can't leak that, right? Or Yuzu didn't leak that. That has to be either somebody on the inside or an early shipment copy got leaked, which has happened since the beginning of time, more or less, games breaking release date, because some games got shipped out too early, or some Walmart somewhere, some mom and pop shop got the wrong memo and they sold games a couple days before they were legally allowed to be sold. I think that's been cracked down on a little bit in the last 5 or 10 years, but it definitely still happens all the time. Like, emulation or no emulation, that's going to happen. Those things almost don't even correlate at all to me. Another one that they pointed out was over 1 million copies of Tears of the Kingdom were downloaded before the game officially released. Again, Yuzu makes emulators. They do not distribute ROMs. The emulator, you can download that 10 million times. None of that is ever going to be illegal. But the fact that they saw Tears of the Kingdom get illegally downloaded 1 million times before the official release date, they went to that and they were like, oh, well, they're downloading it so they can use it on those damn Yuzu machines. And that was the correlation that they were trying to make. And it's like, again, not a lawyer. That's really loose. That's a really soft argument to me. And they were correlating that with the fact that Yuzu's Patreon support went up during that time. But to me, it also makes perfect sense that people would want to download Yuzu emulator so they could, if you're going from a legal standpoint, so they could have that emulator ready for when their Tears of the Kingdom copy got here, because they wanted to play it on a machine that would not lag, that would not stutter, and on a machine that could actually make the graphics look like the game came out in the year that it came out and not 10 years prior. Anyway, that's me ranting on the situation. I need this channel to hit 1,000 subscribers so we can get back to YouTube partnership. That's going to do it for me. Thundershot out. Peace late. Catch you guys next time. Bye.